The black dress arrived on a Tuesday, packed inside a cedar trunk alongside a letter that changed everything Louisa Bancroft had ever believed about the permanence of love. She had been 26 years old when she buried her husband, Robert Bancroft, on a hillside just north of Harlan Creek, Kansas, in the spring of 1878. The earth was still cold and unyielding, the kind of ground that resisted the shovel as if the land itself did not want to receive what grief was asking it to take. Robert had been a good man, a quiet man, a man who had built her a house with his own two hands and who had kissed her forehead every morning before going out to tend his modest plot of farmland. He had died of a fever that swept through the territory in March, one of 14 souls in Harlan Creek who did not survive the month. The doctor, a tired man named Elias Holt who smelled perpetually of carbolic acid, had told Louisa there was nothing to be done. She had sat beside Robert's bed for 6 days and 7 nights, changing cloths, whispering prayers, holding his hand when his breathing grew shallow and strange. And then one morning just before dawn, she had felt the warmth leave his fingers and she had known. The town had been kind in the way towns are kind after funerals, which is to say they had brought casseroles and pies for 2 weeks, and then, gradually, they had returned to their own living. Louisa did not blame them for that. Life in Harlan Creek in 1878 was not a thing that allowed for extended mourning on anyone's behalf. There were crops to plant, cattle to move, children to raise, and the endless daily machinery of frontier survival that ground forward regardless of who had been lost. She understood it. She did not resent it, but she dressed herself in black on the morning after the funeral and she did not take it off. People noticed, of course. In a town of 340 souls, everything was noticed. Mrs. Clara Holt, the doctor's wife, mentioned to Louisa at the general store 6 weeks after the burial that perhaps she might consider returning to her regular clothes, that Robert would have wanted her to. Louisa had looked at Clara with eyes so still and dark that the woman had reached for her basket of flour and said nothing further. The schoolteacher, a young man fresh from Ohio named Theodore Barnes, had tried once to invite Louisa to the church social and had received a reply so flat and final that he had taken to crossing to the other side of the street whenever he saw her coming. The preacher, Pastor Elmore, visited twice in the first month and offered scripture and consolation, and had left both times with the distinct impression that Louisa Bancroft's grief was not a thing that scripture could reach, at least not yet. And so, by the time summer of 1878 gave way to the blazing color of autumn, the town of Harlan Creek had arrived at a collective understanding about its widow. She was not unfriendly, exactly. She paid her accounts at the store on time. She attended Sunday services without fail. She kept her yard clean and her fence mended. But the black dress and the silence that had settled around her like a second skin communicated something that the townspeople of Harlan Creek were sensible enough to respect. She was not ready. She might never be ready. And the most merciful thing they could do was to leave her alone. They left her alone. All of them, that is, except Simon Prescott. Simon Prescott ran the Prescott Ranch, a substantial operation 3 miles east of town on land his father had homesteaded in 1861. He was 32 years old, broad through the shoulders, with hands that bore the permanent roughness of a man who worked hard ground for a living. He had dark hair that went a little longer than was fashionable, and brown eyes that had a quality of steadiness in them that people noticed without always being able to say exactly what it was. He was not a man who talked much, which in itself was not unusual in Harlan Creek, but he had a particular economy of expression that seemed, when he did speak, to mean that what he said carried weight. He had known Robert Bancroft, not well but well enough. They had helped each other during 2 consecutive harvests, sharing equipment and labor in the way that neighbors on the frontier did out of sheer practical necessity. He had liked Robert. He had been sorry when the fever took him. He had attended the funeral, and stood in the back and not said very much because he was not the sort of man who said much at funerals, and he had returned to his ranch afterward and gone back to work because there was always work to return to. Louisa Bancroft's house sat on the north edge of town, and Simon passed it every single morning on his way into Harlan Creek to collect his mail, check in at the feed store, and conduct whatever business the day required of him. The road bent slightly at the edge of town, and her house sat on the inside of that bend, a white clapboard building with a porch that faced east and caught the morning light. In the early months after Robert died, Simon had noticed her sometimes on that porch with her coffee, wrapped in black, watching the road with eyes that did not seem to be looking at anything in particular. He had not planned it. He had not sat down and decided that he would be the one exception to Harlan Creek's collective and well-intentioned silence. It had begun simply and without ceremony, the way most things that matter begin. He had been riding past on a bright April morning in 1878, just 3 weeks after the funeral, and she had been standing on the porch with a coffee cup in her hands and the early light coming across her face, and he had tipped his hat and said, "Morning, Mrs. Bancroft." She had looked at him with those still dark eyes and said nothing. He had ridden on. The next morning he had passed again, and again she was on the porch, and again he had tipped his hat and said, "Morning." She had given him a small, almost imperceptible nod. He had not expected conversation. He had not been looking for it. He had simply said morning and ridden on, and he had said morning and ridden on the morning after that, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. Through April and into May, through the long hot Kansas summer, through the amber slide of autumn and the first biting weeks of winter, Simon Prescott said morning to Louisa Bancroft every single day that he rode into Harlan Creek, which was most days. He never stopped, never lingered, never pressed for acknowledgement. He tipped his hat and spoke and continued on his way, and the whole exchange lasted perhaps 4 seconds and meant nothing to anyone watching, if anyone had been watching at all. But Louisa was watching. She had not wanted anyone to say anything to her. She had been grateful, in her frozen and bewildered grief, for the town's retreat. The casseroles had stopped coming, and the well-meaning visitors had stopped calling, and the whole edifice of social obligation had quietly stood down around her, and she had been able to breathe inside that silence in a way she could not have breathed under the weight of continual sympathy. She had walked through the first year of her widowhood like a woman moving through deep water, everything slow and muffled and requiring tremendous effort. She had kept the house. She had kept the small garden Robert had built for her along the south fence. She had kept herself alive and functional and more or less upright, and she had asked for nothing more from herself or anyone else. And every morning, without fail or fanfare or any apparent expectation of reward, Simon Prescott had ridden past and said morning. She had not thought much about it at first. It had barely registered above the general low roar of her grief. By summer, she had begun to notice it as a kind of rhythm, the way you notice the sound of a creek when you have walked past it often enough that its sound becomes part of the landscape of your days. By autumn, she had found herself, without quite meaning to, watching the road at the approximate time he usually passed, not because she wanted anything from him, not because she had any particular thought about him at all. Simply because it was a thing that happened with regularity in a world that had become terrifyingly unreliable, and the regularity of it had acquired a small but real comfort. She went on wearing her black dress through the winter and into the spring of 1879, through what would have been her and Robert's 5th wedding anniversary, and what was instead just another Tuesday in April, cold and bleak, with the last remnants of a late-season frost on the ground. She sat on the porch that morning with her coffee and she thought about Robert and she cried quietly into the steam of the cup, and Simon Prescott rode past and said morning and she looked up and said, in a voice that was barely more than a thread, good morning. He did not stop. He did not remark on it. He tipped his hat and rode on, and Louisa Bancroft sat on her porch and felt, for the first time in over a year, something shift in the frozen interior of herself. It was not happiness. It was not hope exactly. It was something smaller and less dramatic than either of those things. A tiny crack in the ice, a hairline fracture through which something faint and tentative and very much alive was beginning, almost against her will, to seep. She wore her black dress the next morning, and the morning after that. Simon said morning. She said good morning back, both times, and it became between them an exchange instead of a monologue, though neither of them would have called it that or called it anything at all. The summer of 1879 was dry and fierce, the kind of Kansas summer that makes a person understand viscerally why so many homesteaders had given up and gone back east. The creek dropped to a trickle by July, and the grass on the prairie went the color of old bone, and the air shimmered above the road in the afternoons with a heat that felt personal and hostile. Louisa tended her garden with a stubbornness that was partly practical and partly the expression of some deeper instinct, a refusal to let living things in her care die if she could help it. She hauled water from the well twice a day, and talked to the tomato plants and the beans in a low voice that she would have been mortified to have anyone hear, and her garden survived the summer when many others in town did not. Simon, riding past one morning in late July, happened to glance at her garden and slowed his horse without quite deciding to. She was at the fence with a watering can, her black dress darkened further with perspiration at the collar and cuffs, her dark hair pinned up but escaping in the heat. "Your tomatoes are doing better than mine," he said. She looked up. It was the first thing he had said to her beyond morning. She blinked, and then something that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one moved across her face. "I talked to them," she said. He considered this with the gravity he brought to most things. "I will try that," he said, and rode on. It was perhaps 30 words between them total, but Louisa went back to her watering with something warm in her chest that she did not examine too closely, because examining it felt dangerous, and she was not yet ready for dangerous things. September arrived with cooler air and a collective exhale from everyone in the territory. The harvest, such as it was, came in thin but sufficient. Simon Prescott's cattle were doing well, his foreman Hank Rudell reported, better than they had any right to do given the summer, and the small satisfaction of that gave Simon a quiet pleasure that helped offset the larger loneliness that he carried in him the way some men carry old injuries, not debilitating but always present. He had not been married. People had wondered about this over the years, because he was a man of means and relative good looks and sound character, and the shortage of eligible women in Harlan Creek made every unattached man a subject of community interest and speculation. He had been engaged once 7 years ago to a woman named Margaret Hale who had come from Missouri with her father to Homestead, and who had eventually decided that Kansas was not for her and had gone back. He had not blamed her. He had grieved it quietly, the way he grieved most things, which was to say internally and without visible drama. And then he had gotten on with the work of his life, which was the ranch and the land and the daily 1,000 obligations of keeping something alive and growing in a landscape that was never entirely willing. He was not in love with Louisa Bancroft. He told himself this with enough conviction to believe it was true. He thought she was brave. He thought her grief was a real and worthy thing. He said mourning because it seemed to him the smallest possible human gesture he could make toward a person who had been left very alone, and because it cost him nothing and might cost her something not to have it. That was all. That was the whole of it, as far as he was willing to admit. October brought the cold back, and with it the anniversary of Robert Bancroft's second full year of death. Louisa had been counting the seasons without quite meaning to, measuring her grief against the calendar the way a woman recovering from a long illness measures her strength against what she could do last week and the week before. She could sleep through the night now, most nights. She could go to the store without the weight of other people's sympathy pressing on her like a physical thing. She could look at Robert's photograph on the mantel and feel love and sadness and miss him terribly, and also, underneath all of that, feel herself still present, still alive, still occupying her own body with some degree of willingness. She had been wearing black for over a year and a half. She went to the general store on a Wednesday in late October and stood in front of the bolts of fabric that Hiram Cole kept along the south wall, and she looked at them for a long time. There was a deep blue wool that caught the light in a way that made her think of the sky right after a storm when everything is clean and startled. She touched it with her fingertips. She thought about Robert. She thought about the fact that Robert had loved her in blue, had said once that blue was her color, and that she should wear it always. She thought about the fact that she had been 26 and was now 28, and that the years were not slowing down in deference to her grief. She bought 4 yards of the blue wool and took it home, and let it sit folded on the kitchen table for 2 weeks before she cut it. She made the dress carefully, the way she made everything, with attention and patience and a kind of perfectionism that was less about vanity than about the belief that things worth doing were worth doing well. She had learned to sew from her mother in Pennsylvania before her family had moved west, and she was good at it. The dress took her 3 evenings to complete. It fit well, simple and clean in the style of the time, with a collar that buttoned to the throat and sleeves that caught at the wrist. She hung it on the back of the bedroom door and looked at it in the lamplight, and felt something she could not entirely name. She wore it for the first time on a Thursday morning in November 1879, 20 months after she had put on the black dress and taken the whole town's collective hint to leave her be. She was on the porch when Simon rode past, as she nearly always was at that hour. The morning was cold, the first real cold of the season, with a sky the color of pewter and breath visible in the air. She had her coffee and her blue wool dress and the cold air against her face, and she was watching the bend in the road. Simon came around the bend at his usual pace, and she saw the moment he registered it, a slight slowing of his horse, a look that was brief and careful, and then composed again before he spoke. "Morning," he said, and then, with a gentleness that was entirely natural to him and cost him nothing but meant everything, he added, "That is a fine blue, Mrs. Bancroft." She felt heat in her face despite the cold air. "Thank you," she said. And then, before she could think better of it or weigh the implications of it or do any of the things she was so practiced at doing, she said, "Would you like to stop for coffee, Mr. Prescott?" He stopped his horse. He looked at her with those steady brown eyes, and she looked back at him, and the moment stretched between them, large and full of things neither of them had words for yet. "I would like that very much," he said, and dismounted. He tied his horse to the porch rail and came up the steps, and she went inside for a second cup, and they stood on the porch together in the cold November morning and drank their coffee and looked at the road and talked. They talked about the weather and the harvest and the state of the creek. They talked about whether the winter would be harsh or mild and what that meant for cattle. They talked about the new family that had moved into the old Mercer property east of town, a man named Deacon Walsh and his wife and their 4 children, and what they seemed to be planting. They talked for perhaps 20 minutes, and it was entirely ordinary and entirely unremarkable, and Louisa went back inside afterward and sat down at her kitchen table and pressed her hands flat against the wood, and felt her heart beating in a way that was unfamiliar and alarming, and she admitted to herself with great reluctance, not entirely unwelcome. Simon rode into town with the feeling, deep and warm and slightly terrifying, of a man who has been holding very still for a very long time and has just, without meaning to, begun to move. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. The coffee had not been an open-ended invitation, and he knew better than to assume it was. But on the 3rd day she was on the porch with 2 cups already poured when he came around the bend, and that seemed to him like an invitation explicit enough that he could in good conscience accept it. They developed, over the weeks of November and into December, a routine. He would stop on his way into town, and she would have coffee ready, and they would stand on the porch, or on particularly cold mornings sit inside at the kitchen table with the wood stove throwing warmth against the chill, and they would talk, The conversations lengthened gradually. They moved from weather and livestock and the neutral territories of daily frontier life into things with a little more substance. He told her about his ranch and his plans for expanding the cattle operation if the spring was kind. She told him about the garden and how she wanted to put in a proper kitchen garden in the spring with herbs and a cold frame for extending the season. He asked questions that were attentive and specific in a way that made her realize he had been listening, truly listening, not in the performative way of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but in the quiet and genuine way of someone for whom what another person says matters. She found herself looking forward to it. This fact arrived with some complication, because looking forward to something felt like a betrayal of the grief she had been honoring so carefully. And grief is tricky that way, resistant to being relieved, suspicious of replacement. She talked about Robert sometimes, and Simon listened to those conversations with the same steady attention he gave everything else, not fidgeting or steering the topic away or saying something hollow and consoling, just listening. He said once carefully that Robert Bancroft had been a good man who had been taken too early, and that there was no making sense of that. And Louisa had looked at him and felt the sting of honest tears and said thank you, and meant it down to the bone. Christmas of 1879 was a modest affair in Harlan Creek, as it was in most frontier towns. A church service and a community dinner at the hall, and the small, practical exchange of necessary goods dressed up with a little ribbon. Louisa attended the church service and the dinner, and sat with Clara Holt and her husband, and tried to be present in the moment, rather than in the accumulation of memories that Christmas has a way of surfacing. She did reasonably well at this, better than the year before, and when she saw Simon across the room talking with his foreman Hank and the feed store owner, she caught his eye, and he raised his coffee cup slightly in acknowledgement, and she felt the corner of her mouth lift in response. After the new year turned, January of 1880 coming in hard and bitter with a series of storms that piled snow against the fences and kept the town largely indoors for 2 weeks at a stretch, the morning routine was necessarily interrupted. The road between the ranch and town was impassable on several days, and on the days when Simon did manage to make it in, the cold was fierce enough that lingering on the porch was out of the question. He always stopped, though, even on the worst days, even when it was only for the 4 seconds of his usual morning, before the weather made any further exchange impractical. She always noted it. She always felt, in some interior place she was still learning to trust, the specific comfort of a person who is consistent. February thawed slightly and brought with it the tentative signs of early spring, false signals mostly, since February in Kansas was not finished with winter, but there were mornings when the air had a softness to it that was different from January's iron. On one such morning, Louisa came out to the porch with her coffee and found, to her surprise, that Simon was not alone. Behind him on a second horse was his foreman Hank Rudell, a compact and weathered man of about 40 with a permanent expression of mild skepticism and the kind of silence that comes from decades of outdoor work. Simon had apparently been explaining something to Hank as they rode, and Hank looked at Louisa with a brief, assessing glance and then looked at his employer with an expression that communicated with remarkable economy the words, "So this is what that is about." Simon introduced them. Louisa offered coffee, which Hank accepted with a thank you that was brief but genuine. They talked about the ranch's fencing situation, which Hank apparently had opinions about, and Louisa listened and found that she had questions about the logic of running fence lines along a creek bed and asked them, and Hank looked at her with slightly increased respect and said she was asking the right thing, and that was exactly what he had told Simon himself. Simon looked between them with the expression of a man surrounded by reasonable people who have arrived at a consensus without him. Hank rode on ahead to town. Simon lingered another moment on the porch. "He likes you," Simon said. "He barely spoke to me," Louisa said. "That is how he shows it," Simon said, and she laughed. It was a short laugh, barely more than a breath, but it surprised her with its ease and surprised him with how much he wanted to hear it again. March came in with rain and mud, and the particular exhaustion of a Kansas spring that is working very hard to be what it will eventually be but has not quite gotten there yet. Louisa's garden began to stir. The first optimistic green shoots pushing through the dark-turned earth, and she began spending time out there in the afternoons, planning and preparing with the focused attention of a woman for whom growing things had become not just practical but necessary. There was something in the act of putting seeds in ground, in the daily hope of watching them emerge, that had helped her through the worst of her grief, the simple biological fact of things continuing to grow whether or not you were paying attention to them. Simon, on a Saturday morning when there was no pressure of time and the weather was cooperating, did not ride on after his coffee. He asked if he could see the garden. She led him along the side of the house to the south fence where the beds were laid out, and she explained what she was planting and where, and he walked the length of it with his hands in his coat pockets and the expression of a man genuinely interested, and asked about the cold frame she had mentioned wanting to build. She said she did not have the lumber for it yet. He said nothing to that immediately, which she recognized by now as him thinking rather than dismissing. 3 days later he arrived at her house in the late afternoon with a wagon load of lumber and 2 of his ranch hands, and the measured, matter-of-fact manner of a man who has decided to do something useful, and is doing it without requiring acknowledgement. "You do not have to do this," she said, standing on the porch with flour on her hands from baking. The wood was just sitting, he said, which they both understood was not entirely true, but was the kind of thing you say when you want to do something kind without making it into a production. The cold frame took 2 hours to build. The ranch hands, young men named Billy and Court, who were clearly trying very hard not to appear curious about their employer's charitable construction project, did most of the physical work while Simon directed, and Louisa directed more specifically and occasionally overrode Simon's directions on matters of angle and depth, which he accepted with a good grace that she appreciated. When it was finished and she had thanked the hands and they had ridden back to the ranch, she and Simon stood looking at it in the late afternoon light, the wood smelling clean and new, and she said, "I do not know how to thank you properly." "You do not need to," he said. "You said that as if you mean it," she said. "I do mean it," he said, and looked at her, and for a moment the light was doing something particular to the afternoon and they were standing close enough that she could see the detail of his face, the slight weathering at the corners of his eyes, the steadiness she had noted so many times from a greater distance, and something moved through her that was warm and certain and frightening. She stepped back. She said something about dinner. He said he needed to get back to the ranch. They parted with a politeness that was slightly more careful than their usual ease, and Louisa stood in her kitchen afterward and put her hands on the counter and told herself to be sensible. Being sensible was harder than it used to be. April brought with it what should have been the 2-year mark of her widowhood and everything that carried with it. She woke on the morning of the anniversary with the weight of the day already on her and lay in bed watching the light change on the ceiling and let herself grieve, fully and without defense. She missed Robert. She would always miss Robert. That was not a thing that was going to change or be replaced or be reasoned away. He had been her husband and she had loved him, and he had been taken from her too soon, and the wound of that was real and permanent even if it was no longer bleeding. She got up. She made coffee. She put on her blue dress and went out to the porch. Simon came around the bend and looked at her, and she thought she saw him understand, in the way he understood many things without being told, what the day was. He stopped as he always did now. He did not say only morning. He stopped his horse and looked at her directly and said, "How are you this morning?" "I do not know," she said honestly. "It is the 2 years." He nodded. He stayed quiet for a moment, not filling the space with words that would have made things worse. Then he said, "Would you like company, or would you rather be alone today?" She thought about it. She thought about 2 years of black dresses and frozen mornings and the long interior silence of grief and the small daily miracle of a man who had simply kept showing up with no demand in it. "Company," she said. "Please." He tied his horse and came up and sat with her, and they drank their coffee, and she talked about Robert when she wanted to, and was silent when she needed that. And he stayed until mid-morning when the day had shifted slightly, and the heaviness had not lifted but had changed shape into something more bearable. And she thanked him and he rode on, and she went inside and sat with herself, and the feeling that she was, very gradually, being held back together. Spring moved through its crowded schedule of planting and branding, and the 100 small crises of frontier life, and the mornings continued, and each one was slightly different from the last, the conversations growing in ease and depth, the silences between them becoming the comfortable sort rather than the careful sort. Simon told her about growing up on the ranch, about his father who had been a demanding and difficult man, but an honest one, about his mother who had died when he was 12 from a complication of childbirth that took both her and the sibling she was trying to bring into the world, about the loneliness of being an only child on a large property with a father who expressed love primarily through the assignment of hard work. Louisa listened to all of this with the same quality of attention he had always given her, and she understood from it things about him that explained the morning ritual, the consistency, the complete absence of demand or expectation, the way of doing something kind without requiring it to be named. She told him things too. About Pennsylvania, about her family, about how she had come to Kansas with her parents and her brother Elias when she was 17, and found the land so vast and undecorated compared to the hills back home that she had cried every night for a month from something that was not quite homesickness, but was adjacent to it. About how she had slowly fallen in love with the prairie, with the enormous sky and the grasses and the light, the way someone might fall in love with a difficult person, slowly and reluctantly, and then all at once. About Robert, about meeting him at a church social and thinking he was too quiet, and then discovering that his quietness was not absence but depth. About their years together, the good ones and the hard ones, the way love in daily life is not the thing you imagined it would be before you had it, but is something better and more substantial, built of small things, shared meals and early mornings, and the reliable warmth of a familiar body beside you in the dark. She talked about grief too when it came up, and it came up often because grief is not a thing that stays politely in its corner. She talked about what it had felt like to wear black for 2 years, how it had been armor of a kind, a way of communicating "do not touch me" without having to say the words, how the town had honored that mostly, and how grateful she had been for it. "And you," she said one morning in May, sitting across from him at her kitchen table with the spring light coming through the window. "Why did you keep saying morning, when everyone else had the good sense to leave me be?" He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. He was quiet long enough that she knew he was giving the question its honest weight. "It seemed to me," he said finally, "that leaving someone entirely alone is not the same as giving them peace. There is a difference between respect and absence. I did not want to push anything at you, but I did not want you to feel that because the town had stepped back, you were invisible. Saying morning was the smallest thing I could think of that was something without being anything." She looked at him for a long moment. The morning light was in his face and he was not looking at her with any agenda she could detect, not waiting for a particular response, just present in the simple direct way he was always present. "It mattered," she said, "more than you know, more than I could have told you at the time." "I am glad," he said simply and looked back at his coffee, and the moment settled into the easy comfort that was becoming, without either of them exactly deciding it, the texture of their mornings. It was in June of 1880 that things shifted in a way that was harder to ignore. Louisa had gone to the general store on a Thursday afternoon and had found herself in a conversation with Edna Park, the wife of the man who owned the livery stable, a well-meaning woman who had a talent for saying things that were true in ways that were not entirely comfortable. "You and Simon Prescott are together quite a lot lately," Edna said, in the tone of someone making an observation that is also asking a question. "He stops for coffee some mornings," Louisa said, in the tone of someone answering the surface of the question and leaving the rest. Edna nodded in a way that communicated both understanding and the very clear implication that she understood considerably more than the surface. "He is a good man," she said. "Been a long time since he's had anyone particular to stop for coffee with." Louisa paid for her flour and her thread and went home and did not think about this at all, which meant she thought about it constantly for the next 3 days. She had not allowed herself to think about it directly. She had wrapped it in other language, in the practical vocabulary of friendship and neighborliness, and the ordinary human need for company. But Edna's words had been a mirror, and in the mirror she could see something she had been moving toward for months without quite acknowledging the direction of travel. She was 30 years old and she had loved one man well and lost him, and the pain of that was still with her and would always be with her. But she was also alive, and the proof of being alive was that things still moved her, still surprised her, still made her want to know more. Simon Prescott made her want to know more. He made her laugh, which she had not expected. He made her think, which she had expected less. He made her feel, when he was present, that the world was slightly more navigable than when he was not, and that had been true for a long time now, but she was only just beginning to admit the whole of it. She was not ready to do anything about it yet, but she was, for the first time, ready to admit to herself that there was something to be done about. The summer of 1880 was kinder than the last. Rain came in reasonable intervals, and the prairie stayed green well into July, and the creek ran full, and the garden Louisa had planted with such care was extravagantly productive. The cold frame Simon had built yielding tomatoes and peppers a full 3 weeks before anyone else's garden, a fact she reported to him with a satisfaction she did not attempt to conceal. One afternoon in July, a Sunday when the heat had driven everyone toward shade and stillness, Simon rode over to the ranch and arrived at her door with his hat in his hands and an expression that she had not seen on him before, something that was not quite its usual composure, something slightly undone at the edges. She had been on the porch reading, the one luxury she allowed herself on Sundays, a book she had borrowed from the small lending library that Theodore Barnes maintained at the schoolhouse. She put the book face down on the railing and looked at him. "I wanted to ask you something," he said. "Then come up," she said, because he was standing at the foot of the porch steps as if he had not yet decided whether this was a good idea. He came up. He stood with his hat and the afternoon sun on him, and she waited. "There is a dance at the Kellerman barn on Saturday," he said. "The whole community does it in summer. You may know it. I was wondering if you would come with me." She was quiet for a moment. "As your companion?" she asked, because she was a plain-spoken woman and did not see the advantage of being otherwise. "Yes," he said, "as my companion, if that is something you would want." She thought about it. She thought about Robert and about grief, and about the blue dress she had made in November that had felt like a beginning she was not sure she was ready for, and about every morning since that beginning, and about the cold frame and the lumber and all the easy Saturdays and the coffee, and the way he had looked at her on the anniversary of Robert's death when she had said she wanted company, not like a man with an agenda, but like a man who simply wanted to be useful to her in whatever way was needed. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." Something crossed his face that she could not quite name, but that made her chest feel warm. He put his hat back on. "He said he would come by at 6 on Saturday." She said that was fine. He rode back to the ranch, and Louisa sat with her book in the afternoon sun and did not read a single word of it for the next half hour. The dance at the Kellerman barn was the kind of event that small frontier communities do with great enthusiasm and relatively little sophistication. A fiddle player, a man with a harmonica, the barn floor cleared of hay and swept within an inch of its life, tables along the walls with food contributed by every family in town, children running in frantic circles. the older men standing in clusters discussing cattle prices and weather, and the women occupying the center of things in the particular way that women occupy the center of things when communities gather. Louisa wore the blue dress. She had made a second one by now, a lighter summer weight version in a slightly different shade, and she wore this one with her hair put up properly and her mother's cameo at her throat. And she felt, getting ready in front of the small mirror above her dresser, like a woman who was genuinely herself again in a way she had not been in a long time. Simon arrived at 6 and she opened the door and he stood in her doorway in a clean white shirt and dark trousers with his hat in his hand, and he looked at her and said, quietly, "You look very well, Louisa." It was the first time he had used her first name. She felt it land somewhere specific. She said, "Thank you, Simon," and it was the first time she had used his, and they both understood, without making any remark about it, that something had just changed. They went to the dance together and the town noticed, because the town always noticed, but the noticing this time was warm rather than watchful. People greeted Louisa with a warmth that had been a little absent in the 2 years of the black dress and the careful distance, and she found she was glad of it, glad to be seen as present again, rather than held at the careful remove of someone else's grief. Clara Holt came and kissed her on the cheek and said she was glad to see her looking well, and for once the saying of it felt true rather than obligatory. Simon danced with her twice, which was the number that signified intention without becoming declaration, and he was a surprisingly capable dancer for a man of his apparent solemnity, leading with a confidence that was neither aggressive nor tentative but simply steady, the way he was in most things. She told him this, that he danced well, and he said his mother had made him learn before she died, and that the information had gone unused for a very long time but apparently had not been lost, and she laughed, and he smiled, and the smile was different from his usual expression, warmer and less contained, and she thought she could spend considerable time looking at it without growing tired of it. They stayed late and rode home in the warm dark of the July night, with the stars immense overhead and the prairie air clean and alive around them. Simon walked her to the door and they stood on the porch in the dark for a moment, and she said she had had a very nice time, and he said he had too, and the air between them was full of things that neither of them quite said. And then he said good night, and she said good night, and he walked back to his horse, and she went inside and stood with her back against the closed door, and felt the particular fullness of a life in which more is possible than you had allowed yourself to believe. He asked her to walk with him on Sunday afternoons after that, and she went, and they walked along the creek and across the rolling flat of the prairie, and she learned the topography of his land from his explanations of it, the seasonal patterns and the grazing rotation, and the way certain draws held water after rain and certain hillsides caught the wind in a particular way. He was a man who understood the land in the way that men who have worked the same ground for decades understand it, not academically but in the body, the way a person knows their own house in the dark. She told him once, on an August Sunday when the sky was doing one of its tremendous Kansas performances, purple and gold and red in a way that seemed excessive even by prairie standards, that she thought he was the most genuinely good man she had ever known, which was a large thing to say, and she felt slightly exposed having said it. But he looked at her with those steady brown eyes and said, "I believe you mean that," in a tone of simple receiving rather than deflection. And she thought that this too was a rare and specific quality, the ability to accept something kind without immediately diminishing it. August moved toward September and the quality of the light began to shift the way it does in late summer on the plains, lower and more golden, and carrying in it the first faint suggestion of autumn. They were walking along the North Fork of the creek on a Sunday afternoon when Simon stopped, and she stopped beside him, and he turned to face her, and she thought, looking at him, that she knew what was coming and that she was not afraid of it, which surprised her, because she had thought she would be. "I care for you," he said. "I think you know that. I have for some time. I do not want to rush anything or put anything on you that you are not ready for. But I want to be honest with you about it because that seems more respectful than pretending otherwise." She looked at him in the late summer light and thought about all the mornings, about mornings said into the cold air of 100 different days, about the coffee and the cold frame, and the dancing and the Sunday walks, and the simple extraordinary consistency of a man who had shown up every single day without asking for anything in return. And she thought about who she was now compared to the woman who had stood frozen and black-clad in the spring of 1878, and she knew, with the clarity of someone who has done a great deal of internal reckoning, what she wanted to say. "I care for you too," she said. "I have been trying not to for a little while because it frightened me, but it has not worked particularly well." He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "May I court you, properly I mean, with permission?" She thought about the word properly and felt something warm and slightly amused move through her. This man who had been showing up every morning for over 2 years and had just now asked permission to show up more intentionally. "You may," she said, and watched his face do the thing it did when he was pleased that he did not entirely manage to suppress that particular softening around the eyes. And she thought, this is a good face to know. This is a face I have been learning for 2 years and would like to go on learning. They walked back to town in the golden afternoon light, and she was aware, in a way that was new and specific and very much welcome, of the warmth of him beside her, the way his shoulder was near her shoulder, the way he walked with an unhurried solidity that made the world feel slightly more stable. The courtship that autumn was deliberate and unhurried and deeply, genuinely sweet. He brought her things that were thoughtful rather than grand, a particular variety of seed for the garden he had tracked down through a catalog from back east, a book on kitchen herbs that he had found in the general store's back inventory and thought she would like, a packet of good coffee beans from the same store, when Hiram Cole had managed to get a shipment of something considerably better than the usual blend. She made him meals sometimes, Sunday dinners that extended naturally out of their afternoon walks, and he ate with the uncomplicated appreciation of a man who lives largely on the cooking of his own hands, and a ranch cook who was competent but not inspired. And he said it was the best food he had eaten in years with a sincerity that she could not doubt. She met his men at the ranch, going out one Saturday with him to see the cattle operation, which was more impressive than she had expected, a well-organized spread with a good herd, and the kind of maintained infrastructure that spoke of real attention and long-term thinking. Hank Rudell showed her around with a brief and practical manner that she had come to understand as his version of hospitality, and Billy and Court and the other ranch hands tipped their hats and were polite in the slightly too careful way of men trying to make a good impression on someone who matters to their employer. She liked all of it. She liked the smell of the place and the activity and the particular satisfaction of a working ranch that is doing the thing it is built to do. On the ride home, Simon said, "What do you think of it?" "I think it is exactly like you," she said, "solid and working and better than it looks from the outside." He smiled at that, the warm one that she had decided was her favorite thing about his face. "I will take that," he said. November came and the light shortened and the cold returned, and one morning over coffee at her kitchen table, with the wood stove warm and the steam rising from both their cups, and the easy silence of two people who have learned how to be in the same space, Simon said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand that whatever you say I will respect entirely." She set her cup down. She looked at him. "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not today, not immediately. I know there are things you carry that take time, and I would not ask you to rush any of it. But I want you to know that this is where I am and where I intend to be, if you'll have me." The room was warm and quiet, and outside the window the winter was beginning to make itself known against the glass, and Louisa sat with this question, and the man who had asked it, and the weight of everything she knew about who he was, built over 3 years of mornings and 1 year of something steadily becoming more than mornings. "Yes," she said, And then because she was a plain-spoken woman, not today, but yes. His expression did the thing she loved, the warmth rising in it like a tide coming in, slow and inevitable and complete. "That is enough," he said. "That is exactly enough." They were married in the spring, April of 1881, 3 years almost to the month after Louisa Bancroft had gone into black on a cold hillside north of Harlan Creek. The ceremony was small by choice. A dozen people in the church, Pastor Elmore presiding with his careful and genuine warmth. Clara Holt and Edna parked there from the town. Hank Rudell and Billy attending from the ranch with their hats held correctly, and their boots polished in a way that was clearly an effort, Louisa's brother Elias having traveled from Lawrence for the occasion. The dress she wore was new, not the blue wool but something she had made for the occasion, a soft cream wool with fine detail at the collar and cuffs, and she stood at the front of that small church and looked at Simon Prescott standing there with his steady brown eyes and his hands loose at his sides and his whole bearing that of a man who is exactly where he intends to be. And she felt the love she had for him, which was real and particular and hers, and she felt also the love she had had for Robert, which was also real and particular and permanent in its own way, and she understood that the heart does not divide by addition but enlarges, and that loving again does not undo what came before but carries it differently into a life that is still going and still capable of things. They said their vows and she felt the words settle into her like something solid and true, and when Simon put the plain gold band on her finger and she put one on his hand was steady and warm, and she thought, this is what it is to be held by someone who has already proved they will stay. The wedding supper was at the ranch, a warm and lively affair despite its small attendance, Hank's taciturn exterior cracking enough to produce a toast that was brief and dignified, and moving in its evident sincerity. Elias making the longer and more formal toast that brothers are expected to make, and doing it with the slightly overwhelmed emotion of a man who loves his sister, and had been quietly worried about her for a long time. Louisa's cheeks hurt from smiling by the end of it, which seemed like an excellent problem to have. She moved her things to the ranch. It was a practical exercise, and it was also a profound one. The packing up of the house she had shared with Robert, the deciding of what to keep and what to let go and what to carry forward. She took Robert's photograph and put it on the shelf in her new bedroom, and Simon saw it there and said nothing about it, which was exactly right, and she loved him a little additionally for that. The house at the Prescott Ranch was larger than she had expected, well built but impersonal in the way that houses occupied only by working men tend to be, functional and sparse, with none of the small human decorations that make a building into a home. She set about this with considerable pleasure, the arrangement of things and the addition of things, and the gradual transformation of rooms from barracks-like utility into spaces where someone actually lived. Simon watched this process with an expression of benign bemusement and occasional specific input, saying once, about the curtains she had made for the front room, that he had not known curtains could make such a difference to a room, and she told him that this was because he had been living without them and did not know what he was missing, and he agreed that this was probably true of several things. Summer came in golden and warm and full, and Louisa's new kitchen garden at the ranch dwarfed the one she had kept at her house in town, with the cold frame relocated and expanded and producing with a vigor that delighted her. She and Simon fell into the rhythms of their shared life with an ease that was partly temperament, and partly the result of having known each other well before they committed to knowing each other fully. They had been acquainted with each other's difficulty as well as each other's grace, which is a valuable thing to bring to a marriage, because marriages lived in the daily rather than the romantic require the tolerance of ordinary friction. There was friction, of course. She had opinions about the ranch's bookkeeping that she was not shy about sharing, having a clearer head for numbers than Simon gave her credit for, And when she pointed out to him that he was being charged roughly 11% more than the going rate for one particular feed supplier, and that she could find him a better arrangement, he had looked at her with the expression of a man who is being shown something both obvious and mildly embarrassing, and had said, after a moment, "Would you be willing to manage the accounts?" She said she would and did, and the ranch's finances improved measurably within a year, a fact that Hank Rudell noted with his characteristic brevity by saying to Simon in Louisa's hearing, "Smart woman, Prescott," and that being, from Hank, equivalent to a standing ovation. She and Hank had developed by this point a relationship of mutual and slightly dry appreciation that she treasured for its honesty. He did not flatter her, and she did not flatter him, and they said plainly useful things to each other and occasionally made each other laugh with the kind of humor that is the exclusive product of shared and intimate knowledge of the same difficult subject. In this case, Simon Prescott's occasional and specific stubbornness. By the autumn of 1881, Louisa knew she was expecting. She told Simon on a Sunday morning in September, in the kitchen with the light coming through her new curtains and the smell of coffee and early wood smoke in the air, and she watched his face do something it had never done before, the steadiness giving way completely to a pure and undefended joy that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took her face in his hands and kissed her, and she laughed against his mouth and said he was going to spill the coffee, and he said he did not care about the coffee, and she said she did, and he kissed her again anyway. The winter of 1881 moving into 1882 was a nesting time, a drawing inward of the life they had built together around the growing fact of the child coming. Simon was attentive without being suffocating, which was a line that was easy to misjudge, and he managed it well, largely by being himself, which was to say present and practical, and not prone to treating her as though pregnancy were an illness rather than a condition. He took on the heavier work in the garden without comment when she was tired in the mornings. He made sure the woodbox was always full. He sat with her on winter evenings with her feet in his lap, while she worked on the small garments and blankets that were accumulating in the nursery with the speed of items made by an organized and energetic woman who has a project she cares about. They talked in those evenings about everything and nothing, about the ranch and the town and the state of things in Kansas and the wider world, about books and about memories, and about the future they were building in the very particular way that people who love each other talk, which is less about the exchange of information than about the pleasure of exchanging it with this specific person. She talked about Robert sometimes still, and Simon listened still, with the same quality of attention he had always given it, and once she said, "Does it bother you that I still speak of him?" And Simon said without hesitation, "No. He was part of who you are, and who you are is everything to me. Why would I want less of you?" She had no answer for that except to take his hand and hold it. The baby came in April of 1882, a boy, born on a raw spring morning that was trying hard to be warmer than it actually was. Dr. Holt came out, and the birth was long and not without difficulty, and Louisa was spectacularly capable throughout it, in a way that impressed even the tired doctor. And Simon paced the hall for 4 hours with a restraint that was clearly costing him something. And when Holt came out and said she was fine and the boy was fine, and did he want to come in, Simon went through that door so fast that the doctor had to step aside. The child was red and emphatic, and not particularly interested in being told what to do, which Simon said was exactly what he should have expected. Louisa held him in the lamplit room, and he was heavy and warm and miraculous in the specific and stupefying way that all new humans are miraculous to the people who love them. And she looked at Simon where he sat on the edge of the bed beside her, and his face was entirely without its composure, which she had discovered she loved best. They named him James Robert Prescott. James for Simon's father, whatever his faults. Robert for Robert Bancroft, who had been a good man and deserved to be remembered. Simon had suggested it himself, and Louisa had looked at him when he did and understood again, with fresh conviction, exactly who she had married. James grew the way ranch children grow, fast and physical and thoroughly embedded in the machinery of the place, toddling after his father and the ranch hands with a determination that made the hands fond of him, and occasionally concerned for their equipment. He had Simon's steadiness and Louisa's will, which was both a recipe for a formidable human being and for a parent's endurance test, and they navigated it together with the combination of love and strategy that good parents develop. Louisa had resumed her full management of the ranch accounts and had also, over the course of a year or two, become something of a resource for other families in the area who were struggling with the financial complexity of frontier life. She had a clear mind and a practical approach, and she could explain things in plain language, and word had gotten around in the way that things get around in small communities. She helped 2 farming families restructure their debts to the general store and the bank in Wichita in ways that were substantially better for them. And she helped Edna Park set up a proper account for the livery stable that clarified how they were doing in ways that Edna found useful and her husband found humbling. None of this was formal or compensated. It was simply the use of a skill on behalf of neighbors, which was how most things in Harlan Creek operated, but it gave her a specific satisfaction and a sense of her own usefulness in the community that she valued. The town, which had left her alone for 2 years and then welcomed her back with a warmth she had not fully anticipated, had come to regard her and Simon as one of those pairings that seems, in retrospect, entirely obvious, the sort of couple who make a community feel that things sometimes work out as they should. People said that Simon Prescott had always been a fine man who needed the right person, and that Louisa Bancroft had always been a fine woman who had been through something that would have broken a lesser soul, and that together they were something particularly good, which was true, and which both of them knew and were grateful for. In the spring of 1884, their second child arrived, another boy, which Simon greeted with a joy that Louisa found immensely amusing given that she had been the one to do the work of it, and they named him William, which had been Louisa's father's name and her preference, and Simon had no objection. Will, as he was almost immediately called, was from his first days a different creature than his brother, quieter and more observant, with Louisa's dark eyes and a watchful quality that made people address him more seriously than they sometimes addressed small children, as if they intuited that there was more happening behind those eyes than his age should account for. James and Will were, as brothers can be, both deeply bonded and comprehensively incompatible, which is to say they loved each other with the whole and unself-conscious fullness of children, and also fought with a dedication that was impressive in scope and regularity. Louisa and Simon navigated the management of both of them with a partnership that had by now become very well worn in the best possible way, each of them knowing the other's approach and limits and strengths, knowing when to defer and when to insist and how to disagree in ways that were honest without being destructive. 1885 brought a succession of events that tested the ranch and the community both. A cattle disease moved through the territory in the summer, affecting several herds, and while Simon's operation was partially protected by Hank's early identification of the problem and the rapid isolation of affected animals, they still lost 15 head and had a summer of hard work and anxiety that stretched everyone on the property. Louisa managed the financial impact with the practicality she brought to all things, adjusting their accounts and planning their spending with a precision that kept them sound, while others around them struggled. And Simon told her more than once that the ranch's stability through that summer was substantially her doing, which she accepted because it was true, and because she had learned from him that accepting honest credit was not immodest but decent. The community of Harlan Creek was not without its difficulties more broadly, and Louisa was not unaware of them. The winter of 1885 was severe, and 2 families on the edge of town lost their farms to foreclosure, unable to service debts after the hard summer, and the community effort to support those families was genuine but not sufficient to prevent the loss. She was aware of the particular injustice of banks and land companies operating at distance from the human reality of frontier life, making decisions from offices in Wichita and Kansas City that fell on living people with terrible weight. She wrote letters on behalf of the Kavanaugh family to their lender, letters that delayed the foreclosure by 4 months and gave them time to arrange better terms elsewhere. And she felt the particular fury of a person who understands numbers well enough to see exactly how the system is designed to serve those who already have and to take from those who do not. She could not fix it from where she stood, but she could apply whatever leverage was available, and she did, consistently, for as many people as she could reach. Simon shared these convictions. He had grown up on land that his father had fought to hold and had watched neighbors lose theirs, and he had the rancher's visceral understanding that the land is not an abstraction, but the thing your life is made of, and that losing it is not a financial setback, but a kind of death. They were aligned in this, as they were aligned in most things that mattered, and their conversations about it were the kind of conversations that sustain a marriage, the kind that demonstrate that the person you are with sees the world the way you see it, or enough that the differences are interesting rather than divisive. By 1886, the Prescott Ranch was well established and prospering in the careful way of people who plan and work and do not overextend. James was 4 and a serious enthusiast of horses, having fallen deeply in love with the animals at approximately the age of 2 and never wavered, and Simon had taken to sitting him on the gentlest of the ranch horses on Sunday afternoons and walking alongside, which produced in the boy a happiness so pure and total that watching it was its own reward. Will was 2 and had developed the opinion that everything on the ranch was his to investigate, a position that required constant gentle correction, and that everyone on the property had tacitly agreed to enforce together, because no single person was sufficient to the task. Louisa was 36 and Simon was 42, and they were in the full and particular richness of a life that had been built carefully and was bearing the fruit of that care. The ranch house was fully a home now, warm and organized and personal in all the ways that it had not been when she had first moved into it, with her curtains and her garden and her books, and the photograph of Robert on the shelf, and the children's drawings pinned above the kitchen hearth, and the smell of good cooking and wood smoke, and the honest domestic fragrance of a house in which people are living fully. She still thought about Robert. The thinking about him had changed over the years, had lost the acute pain of early grief and become something more like tenderness, a love that had completed its course and settled into memory without bitterness. She was glad for the years she had had with him. She was glad that loving him had made her the person who had been capable of loving Simon. She understood, in the way that life eventually teaches those who are willing to learn it, that love is not finite, and that the losses we carry do not diminish the loves we build but give them depth and seriousness, and a kind of tested quality that makes them stronger. The spring of 1887 brought a letter from Louisa's brother Elias, who had stayed in Lawrence after Robert's death and built a small but solid life there as a school teacher. He wrote that he was getting married to a woman named Catherine who taught with him, and who he described with the slightly awkward enthusiasm of a man not accustomed to talking about his own feelings, and he asked whether they might come for the wedding in June. Simon said of course they would come, and they made the journey to Lawrence by train, a considerable undertaking with 2 small boys, and Louisa met Catherine and liked her immediately for her directness and her humor and the clear quality of her love for Elias, which was evident in the way she attended to him without managing him, and she told Elias afterward that he had done very well, and he had the grace to look pleased rather than dismissive of the assessment. The summer of 1887 was warm and ordinary and good, the best kind of summer, the kind where nothing exceptional happens but everything that happens is worthwhile. Simon finished a renovation on the barn that had been planned for 2 years, a project that he and Hank and the men undertook together with the collective satisfaction of work that was practical and visible and done well. Louisa expanded the garden again with a cold frame extension and a new section for the herbs she had been planning since before the marriage, finally achieved and thriving in a way that gave her specific pleasure every time she walked past it. James started at the schoolhouse in September, which event he greeted with the equanimity of a child who has grown up in a household where learning was treated as interesting rather than obligatory. And Theodore Barnes, who had long since stopped crossing the street to avoid Louisa, and had in fact become a neighbor of the friendly acquaintance variety, sent home a note after the first week saying James was attentive and asked excellent questions, which made his parents extremely proud in the way of people who are trying not to make it obvious how proud they are. In October of 1888, their third child came, and this one was a girl. She arrived in the early morning with the kind of decisive efficiency that suggested she had places to be, and she was small and dark-haired, and immediately the most interesting thing her brothers had ever encountered. James studying her with the absorbed attention of someone encountering a new and fascinating phenomenon, and while touching her hand with a tenderness that his usual 2-year-old energy had not prepared anyone to expect. They named her Clara, for Clara Holt, who had been the first person to welcome Louisa back, quietly and without drama, when she had put the black dress away. Clara Holt had died the previous winter, peacefully and at home, and the naming was an acknowledgment of a kindness remembered. Simon had agreed to the name immediately, and it suited the child, who was from her earliest weeks clearly going to be someone of distinct personality. The ranch went on growing, and the family went on growing, and Harlan Creek went on being the slightly rough-edged and deeply human community that frontier towns are, full of the whole range of what people can be when they are trying to survive together in difficult country. Louisa continued her work with the account books of her neighbors, a practice that had become formalized enough by now that people specifically came to her with their financial questions, and the usefulness of it gave her a sense of purpose that sat comfortably alongside the purposes of mother and wife and ranch partner, and every other role that her life had assigned her. Simon, in his 40s, had a quality of settledness that she found immensely attractive, which she told him, and he received in his usual way, with genuine pleasure and no performance. He had been a good rancher and became a better one, partly through experience and partly, she suspected, because having a family to build it for had given him a different relationship to the future than he had had when he was building it only for himself. He was a good father, consistent and attentive and funny in the dry, an understated way that his children responded to by laughing, and then looking at their mother to verify that something funny had been said. There were evenings in that time, late in the 1880s when the house was settled, and the children were finally, improbably, all asleep, and the wood stove was ticking down and the lamps were burning low, when Louisa sat in the front room with Simon across from her, and the quiet of the house around them, and she thought about the woman who had stood at a grave on a cold hillside in 1878 and could not have known, what was waiting. She thought about the morning that had come after, and the morning after that, and the single word said from a horse to a porch with no demand or expectation in it, just the simple and persistent acknowledgement of another person's existence. She thought about how much had been built from that beginning, how much life had grown from such a small and consistent seed. She had been loved twice in her life by men who were genuinely good, in different ways and in different seasons, and the understanding of that had given her a generosity toward the world that she had not had in her grief, a patience with the difficulty of living, and a faith in the possibility of things being better than they currently are that was grounded not in naivety, but in evidence. She had the evidence of her own life. She had the evidence of mornings. One such evening in the winter of 1889, With the fire low and the boys long since in bed and Clara in her cradle near the hearth because she had been fussy and proximity to the warmth helped, Simon looked up from the book he had been reading and said, "I have been thinking about something." She looked at him. "That is usually productive," she said. He smiled. "I want to put another parcel to the east under cultivation in the spring. The Deacon Walsh property came up for sale last month. It would extend our range considerably." She had already been thinking about this. She had noticed the notice in the Harlan Creek weekly paper and done the arithmetic in her head. "The asking price is high," she said. "It is," he said, "but the land is good, and we are in a position to do it, particularly if you negotiate the terms." She looked at him. "You are asking me to negotiate." "I am asking if you are willing to," he said, "because you will get a better arrangement than I will." "That is true," she said. "I will look at the figures and let you know what I think we can do." "I know what you will tell me," he said. "You will tell me we can do it if we structure it correctly and avoid overextension, and then you will structure it correctly and we will not overextend." "You say this as if it is inevitable," she said. "It is," he said simply, with the full and undefended certainty of a man who has complete confidence in the person across from him, and she felt the warmth of that, as she had felt it so many times, like a hand cupped around something small and alive to keep the cold from getting in. She did negotiate the Walsh property the following spring, and acquired it at a price considerably below the asking figure, and the land went into cultivation the following season, and proved as good as Simon had thought it would. The ranch expanded and settled into its new shape, larger and more complex, and requiring more of both of them, which they gave it without complaint because the giving was for something they had built together and that was theirs. James, at 7, had learned to ride properly and had declared firmly that he was going to be a rancher, and that Will could be whatever he wanted, but James's position on his own future was settled. Will, at 5, had not yet declared anything, being a child who preferred to observe extensively before committing to an opinion, but he had a particular attraction to the schoolhouse and to books that suggested his path might lie in a different direction than his brother's. Clara, at 2, had declared nothing except a comprehensive desire to be wherever the most interesting thing was happening, and an iron refusal to be redirected. In the autumn of 1891, on a Sunday afternoon when the light was the color of old gold and the air had the first cold edge of the season in it, Louisa walked with Simon along the fence line of the north pasture, which they often did on Sunday afternoons still, a habit carried forward from the early weeks of their courtship. The children were back at the house with Hank's wife, a cheerful woman named Martha who had come to work for the ranch 3 years ago and who had become indispensable in ways that went well beyond her formal employment. They walked without talking for a while, the way people who are comfortable with each other walk, not filling the silence but inhabiting it together. The cattle were visible in the far field, moving slowly in the way of well-fed animals on a calm day. The grass was dry and rustled at their feet. The sky, as always, was enormous. Simon took her hand. It was such a simple and ordinary thing, the way he took her hand, no ceremony to it, just his hand finding hers in the way it had found it 1,000 times, and she felt the familiar warmth of it and looked at him, and he was looking at the pasture with his steady face and the particular quality of contentment in it that she had come to know as his version of happiness. "Are you glad?" he said. It was not a question about anything specific. She understood that. She thought about the black dress folded in the cedar trunk at the back of the closet, kept not out of morbidity but out of honesty, a thing that had happened and was real and did not need to be hidden. She thought about Robert's photograph on the shelf and the name they had given their oldest son. She thought about mornings, specifically mornings, about the extraordinary fact that a day starts new every day regardless of what the day before was. She thought about the cold frame in her garden and the figure in the accounts ledger, and the sound her children made when they were all asleep in the house at once, which was the sound of her life more full than she had known to hope for. "Yes," she said, and meant it to its depths. "I am very glad." He squeezed her hand and they walked on, into the golden afternoon and the wide Kansas sky. The ranch and the house and the children and the life spread out around them in every direction. Every day of it built on something that had begun as simply as possible. A man on a horse who said morning and kept saying it, patient and consistent and without demand, until the morning came when she could say it back. The years that followed were good years. There were hard seasons, as there always are when you stake your life to land and weather, and the uncertain arithmetic of farming and ranching. There was a drought in 1893 that tested everyone in the territory and required Simon and Louisa to make careful and difficult decisions about the herd. There was the death of Hank Rudell in 1895, which was a genuine loss, mourned by everyone on the ranch with the specific grief of people who have lost someone who was their daily world, and they found a good foreman eventually, a man named George Tanner who was competent and reliable, but who was not Hank, and who they never expected to be. There was also the year James turned 14 and had a growth spurt that made him suddenly taller than his mother, and almost as tall as his father, which event he marked by becoming briefly insufferable in the way of adolescent boys who have discovered height, before emerging on the other side of it somewhat improved. There was Will's increasing and obvious academic ability, which led to the letter from a school in Topeka that offered him a scholarship at 15, a letter over which Louisa and Simon sat at the kitchen table and discussed seriously and at length and ultimately encouraged Will to take, because the world beyond Harlan Creek was real and had things to offer, and they were not people who would hold their children back from it out of their own need to keep them close. Will went and wrote home every week, letters that were detailed and curious and full of the new world he was encountering, and he came home for holidays and summers and grew into a young man of striking intelligence and warmth, who loved his family and his origins without being confined by them. Clara grew into her personality, which was formidable, and became at 10 the sort of child who asks adults direct and inconvenient questions and does not accept inadequate answers, a quality that made her the delight of some and the mild alarm of others, and that her parents regarded with pride and occasional weary amusement. She had her mother's practicality and her father's stubbornness, and a social confidence that belonged entirely to herself. And the schoolhouse teacher, who had succeeded Theodore Barnes upon that gentleman's retirement in 1892, told Louisa that Clara was the most intellectually alive student he had in her year, which Louisa received with the satisfaction of a woman who knows exactly what it costs to bring that particular child to that particular point. By the turn of the century, the Prescott Ranch was one of the more established operations in its part of Kansas, not the largest but among the most respected, known for the quality of its cattle and the soundness of its management and the reliability of the people who ran it. Simon was 54 in 1900, older but not slowed, his dark hair gone to gray but his hands still strong and his eyes still steady, and his morning still said to Louisa every single day before he went out to the ranch work, because some habits, once formed for good reason, deserve to be kept forever. She was 48, and she thought of herself as being in the fullest part of her life, the part where everything planted has grown and can be seen and assessed, and loved in its actual form rather than its potential. Her children were launched or launching. Her work in the community was established. Her home was what she had made it. Her marriage was the thing she returned to at the end of every day, like returning to a place that is yours in the deepest possible way. James was running a substantial portion of the ranch by this time under his father's oversight, and it was clear that when Simon stepped back from the day-to-day, the operation was in capable hands. James had married a woman named Ruth from a farm 20 miles east, a steady and sensible woman who had her own opinions about the kitchen garden, and who Louisa welcomed with an open hand, because she recognized in Ruth the particular quality of someone who will love what they have built rather than resent what they have inherited. They planted a new tree that spring, a cottonwood on the south side of the ranch house, because cottonwoods grow fast and give good shade, and because Simon had promised Louisa a shade tree on the south side years ago and had finally gotten around to it, a fact she noted with both amusement and affection. They planted it together on a Saturday afternoon, she and Simon and James and Clara, who had recently turned 12, and who participated with the focused energy she brought to all things, declaring the placement of the whole with an authority that made James pretend to defer to her and made her father smile. When the tree was in the ground and watered and standing in its small and hopeful way against the afternoon sky, Simon stood beside Louisa and looked at it and said, "It will be a good tree in 10 years. We will be here in 10 years, she said. Yes, he said, we will. They stood in the late afternoon warmth, and the tree stood in its new earth, and the ranch spread around them, and the life they had made together was everywhere she looked. In the fence lines and the garden and the house with its curtains and its bookshelf and Robert's photograph and James calling something to his father from the barn, and Clara already heading back toward the house with purpose, and Will's last letter still on the kitchen table waiting to be answered. She had been dressed in black for 2 years on a porch in a town that had the kindness to leave her alone. And every morning from the road outside, a man on a horse had said the smallest possible thing, just morning, just the one word, just the daily proof that she was seen. And from that smallest possible thing, this whole enormous life had grown. She took Simon's hand and he held it without looking away from the tree, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing left to say that the years had not already said more eloquently than either of them could manage. The evening was coming in gold across the prairie, and the new tree cast its first small shadow in the long light, and Louisa Bancroft Prescott stood in her life and felt it complete around her. Not finished, never finished while there was still morning coming, but complete in the way that things built with love and patience and the daily willingness to show up become complete, whole in themselves, real in every part, and more than anything she had known to ask for.